So we had talked a little earlier, and I had about ways to kind of connect what this is happening directly to the play itself. And one of the questions that I had, so I was meditating also on the title, as Mary Beth said, that the title of this is I Am Lucrece, which you know, at first blush, when I heard it, I said, of course, you know, this is something that's about solidarity, it's about standing up, it's about empowering women to speak. I mean, this is Take Back the Night, this is all these other things. And then when I was sitting and watching the play, and we all went to see it, so I want to hear also your reactions to that experience. I realized that it's more than that. That this is a woman on whose body a republic was founded, and so and this goes a lot to what Mary Beth was saying. There are bigger ideas here about education and about identity, but also, as Vanessa was saying, there are issues about womanhood and the way women's bodies are used still to this day. And so I was wondering sort of what you guys thought about that, about what it means to stand up with Lucrece and what it means to stand up generally as a woman.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing in your question is, that I want to focus on is sort of how people of all genders are affected by sexual violence. But when we think about historically how women's bodies have been used to sort of establish, you know, great civilizations or advance them or kind of expand them, I can't not think about just the history of our own nation and how, you know, the rape of Native American women's bodies is so deeply tied to, you know, the founding of our country, and that's a legacy that continues today. Indigenous women experience the highest rates of sexual violence of any community. So, you know, thinking about how bodies are used not only to exert power on the individual, but to, you know, exert power over communities and to control women, to control people through their bodies, is not an isolated thing, and it's depressingly, you know, deeply tied to power and how, you know, states are able to exert their power, and how just notions of, you know, land being inherently invadable and women's bodies being inherently rapeable or conquerable. So I think about Native American women's bodies, and I think about Black women's bodies in terms of slavery and how, you know, so much of, again, our nation's economy, our nation's founding is deeply tied to the rape of Black women's bodies throughout slavery, and, you know, controlling them in order to create more property, to create more slaves, but also, again, to sort of dehumanize and rob people of control over their own bodies. So, you know, I think there hasn't been as much of a focus on those histories in the current movement as there should be. But I think, you know, I think the Atlantic had a great article about what does rape culture look like on an Alaskan reservation. That was like very fascinating. So those conversations are happening, sort of. But you know, I think to get back to your original question, like, what does it mean to say I am Lucrece? What does it mean to stand with all women, all people who experience sexual violence? I think it means, you know, thinking about how this is a historical question and how you can't stand with all survivors if you're not thinking about, you know, how the fact that we're like sitting in this building is, you know, related to the fact that so much rape has happened against Native American women. So, yeah, I think the really interesting way of connecting the play to this movement and to this activism is, you know, I think we should be challenging ourselves to think more about how is, you know, our country, our nation state, you know, how has it been enabled by sexual violence, and constantly challenging ourselves to find that part of the story that I think has been explicitly written out of our history. And in the way that we silence survivors today, I think we've silenced survivors historically, and kind of whitewashed our history to forget about that.
Yeah, I think that, the amazing thing about this movement is that there's not a lot of shame attached to being a rape survivor now, right? And of course, that is part of this play that we are discussing. I'm forgetting where I read this, but somebody said, this happened so quickly. Don't they know that just yesterday people were saying she wore that skirt, she wanted it? Like, how did this happen? It seems like this happened so quickly. And it's true that the image that we see of survivors in the media, and I certainly am complicit in this because I thought it was so fascinating, is so strong and warrior-like and taking on the man. And behind the curtain, of course, there's a lot more going on. And you may have people like me who want to show the strong side because we think it hasn't been shown in the media that much. Or you may have people who feel too weird about talking about the other side, or it makes them uncomfortable. But I think that alleviating that and saying not only is it not your fault, but there shouldn't be guilt, and you should not feel that you cannot express this. This can be a part of your holistic part of your identity and can be like something that you present, and it's not going to hurt you. I mean, interestingly, somebody that I interviewed who was a professor said, many women are willing to come out with their names. Perhaps they think, well, I'm going to work in social justice. I don't mind if my name is out here, or they think this is the right thing to do, I'm going to do it, or they think, the culture we're living in today, it doesn't really matter the way that it used to, and it doesn't matter as much for young people. But she said, interestingly, the men who are raped do not want to put their names out there, and it's very, very rare that they can get a man to speak with his full name. And so I think that speaks a lot to the different constructions of femininity and masculinity at this moment, when we are seeing this shifting sands around the construction of rape survivor identity, that it's not really, maybe not the same for guys. I, for one, would love to read a story like that or interview somebody like that, because I think it would be really fascinating. And there have been a few stories, but yeah.
So this is actually a follow-up. I have so many questions. They kind of like pile on each other. But how do you guys think what is happening now is different from? I mean, there's a lot of ways I can see that it's indebted to the legacy of feminist activism and anti-rape activism. And if I'm not wrong, one of the mattresses is being carried by Take Back the Night, which is, that is a movement that has been in a lot of ways ongoing on college campuses for decades. So how is this moment different? Like, what makes this, what's happening now, unique?
Well, I sound like a broken record, but the mainstream media is listening, and the politicians are listening. So it's like if you got the Huffington Post and the New York Times and Senator Gillibrand and McCaskill, and they're going to have a bipartisan group, who else needs to listen? That's who you need to have listen. So I think that in terms of, why? Again, we don't want to say because the internet, but it's allowed activists to network and to pull together disparate experiences at disparate campuses that didn't happen in the 90s. There was not email, so that was not happening. But that's really true. People were not talking to each other. Actions were not coordinated. So, when you think about, I don't know, after Emma came out with the mattress, maybe 20 different schools, different students carried mattresses. I'm assuming that was not coordinated. But this last, Day of Solidarity with Emma on October 29th, that was organized in part by Mary Beth and by Zoe and all these other people at Columbia, was an organized effort at 130 campuses to carry these mattresses. So there was no way in 1995 right? I mean, you would have had to send like a carrier pigeon. Like, I don't know how you would have done that. So,
there were a lot of phone trees, I think. A lot of phone trees.
Yeah.
You are also young.
I think that's true that, it's different because Jill Brand's paying attention. It's different because the New York Times is paying attention. But the reason they're paying attention is because, in part, of Andrea Pino and Annie Clare, who are two activists who started NRAPE on Campus, which helped survivors file Title IX complaints against their universities. And they helped me, and they helped Zoe and the rest of our group file our Title IX complaint. And I remember having an initial conversation with them where they kind of sort of shared their approach and their tactics and said, we looked at Amherst, like you mentioned, and we saw that there was Angie Epifano who had her personal story. She had her story, it got a lot of attention, but that was it. There wasn't really the organized movement around it that had sort of policy proposals attached to it. And then you had Yale, which had a lot of policy proposals. It had a lot of the kind of specific interfacing with the administration, but it didn't really have the narrative public face to it. And I think one of the reasons Columbia has been so prominently featured in the media and so successful is because we have both. We have the organized movement that meets probably 6 days a week, if not more, that is kind of taken over these activists' lives, that is so intensely organized and really, really smart. And those people are also sharing their stories. So I think there's you have to have both for people to really understand how this is a movement. Because it's one thing to say like, oh, I heard of this girl, Emma Solkowitz, and like she had this terrible story, and she's carrying this mattress, and it's so amazing, end of sentence. But if you can add to that, it's such an amazing story, and there's so many people that are coming up with like structural, institutional things that need to change so that there are no more Emmas in the future. I think that's what gets people's attention, and that's why this is so different. I think the personal is political adage is an old one, but it's really true here. And I think you see way more activists who are willing to be personal and political at the same time, and that's not very common.
But it has a double-edged. I mean, this is a problematic. When you found a movement on one case or on one person's story, or when those stories get brought to the forefront, we were talking about this earlier, there's this, and we all feel it, right? One of the reasons it's so interesting to read is there's I think a natural human tendency to want to know what the truth is. And you feel like if you poke at it enough, you can figure out what exactly happened, and then the whole thing will be settled. And I think to me, that's so interesting. So there are two things that I'd love to hear your perspective on. On the one hand, and this is a long feminist conversation, is that when you have a case, when you have a body, when you have a woman's story in front of you who's claiming a narrative, and you ask her to say it over and over again, that's re-traumatizing, right? So there's this question of if by making someone say their story over and over again, are you actually, in a lot of ways, adding to that trauma and adding to the trauma of others by forcing them to come forward, right? So this. And the fact that there are many, many people who will not participate in this because it's too traumatizing to have to go through this. So that's, one problem. But the other is that it gives you this false sense that if we just knew what happened, if Columbia just reopened this case and made a better ruling, then the whole thing would stop, which is actually not the case at all. Or at least I'd like to, do you think that if they did this, if they figured out what happened, if there was truth that was revealed, would this end? Would that end the movement?
Well, I don't think it's about, if only we knew these extra things about Emma's case, then, because I think we know her case really well, and I think everyone that I know who's heard it says, this is ridiculous, he should have been found responsible. So I don't think it's a matter of, if only we knew these. But
if only we knew why he wasn't found responsible. If only we could fire the person. Because I'm thinking about this.
Right? It's not one person. I've met all the people who are responsible for him getting away with it. And they are all collectively enabling, a lot of, misjustice. So I think, Emma's case is helpful, and also our movement has to be more than Emma. And I think it is more than Emma. I think she's a very helpful rallying symbol, and she is not an activist, she is an artist, and this is how she is, I think this is part of her healing process. So this is an interesting part of it too, is that I think for a lot of survivors who are sharing their stories publicly and, participating in activism as a way of seeking justice, it is a deeply personal thing. Like, to be a part of activism is, for many people, their way of getting justice. It is their healing process. It is not outside of it is deeply connected to it. So I think the whole issue of opening up her case and, getting, I think, that decision, reconsidered is, for her individual sense of justice, that is what she needs, and I completely understand that. That is not what every survivor needs, and I think the movement is trying to expand our notion of what does justice look like, because there is no one version. And I think every single survivor has a different experience with sexual violence and understands it differently, and they have a different sense of what justice and healing would mean for them. So, and again, I think you're right to point out that there are downsides to having one individual and their case so open and so picked at by the media. But hopefully the conversation is focused on how this is what Emma needs, this is not what every single person needs, or this is the solution. Once her rapist is found responsible, then we can pack it up and go home. I wish that were the case, because that would be a little bit, that's a little bit easier to achieve than the eradication of rape culture. But yeah, I don't know. I think it is really challenging, and I'm hopeful that we're going to continue to see that balance of individuals who, just by the very nature of coming forward, and it's interesting, we refer to it as coming out as a survivor. So there's sort of a learning from other social justice movements and their terminology at play here in terms of, it's an analogy to coming out as queer or gay or lesbian or trans, and that, part of just really saying your truth is your activism, is your sense of justice, is your healing. So it's complicated. I think it's hard to, I think the whole personal political, having one story that's so high profile is really helpful. But again, we have to move beyond that, because it's exhausting to have to share over and over and over. And I think Vanessa, some of your colleagues, not necessarily you, don't really know how to interview survivors. And I think there's a lot for journalists to learn about. Yeah, could you really stop asking about that detail, because I don't want to talk about it. And I think there's sort of an interesting relationship between survivors and the media that maybe we can talk about too.
Yeah, I think that, Emma, I think, gave an interview where she talked about how she felt a little bit attacked that first week after she had the mattress, because, journalists were coming there and they wanted to talk to her, and a good journalist stops at nothing to get the interview, right? So they were going to get it one way or another, even if that meant really invading her personal space, or sending weird emails, or calling her names, or whatever. This is, stuff that journalists unfortunately do every day. I think, I'm not that concerned about Emma's case being problematic, although now that you bring it up, I see what you're saying in terms of longevity. But to me, maybe because, as Mary Beth says, I have now heard this many, many, many times, I'm not that interested in the details of her case. I really have heard the details of her case. But the image is so awesome, and the image is so powerful, and in some ways,
the image of her with the
mattress. Because the man's name is out there, and if you want to go into a hole on the internet, you probably can and find the few snitches of information you would want to find. I don't know, I'm not that interested in him or the case. Like, I would be much more interested in hearing, like, who are these boys from Hobart and William Smith, and like, what are their lives like right now? You know, like, I'm much more interested in hearing about some of the other perpetrators we've heard about, of which very, very little is known. But I think that, you know, the likelihood of Columbia reopening the case is not huge. Perhaps if there was somebody else who wanted to bring a case, that would be more effective. And, you know, I just think, I would assume that the thought is that the reason that they won't open it is because we have rules here, right? And that's the whole point of this, which is like, what are your rules that you have here that you're so proud of? And so, I think you're right, and I think that, you know, as we were discussing earlier, and several students brought up with me, a lot of the key organizers are seniors. What happens next year? You know, there are schools like Occidental where they did a ton of activism, it was really heated up, and people just started to graduate, and people started to get tired, you know, and where it happens then. And then you got a lot of broken people, a lot of tired people, and if you don't bring up the next group, if you don't really look to the freshman and the sophomore and get them in the tradition, then you're probably not going to go someplace. And, you know, the story then goes, but the universities know that, and that is possible. I mean, that's possibly the long game that they're aware of. I also think, you know, in this whole discussion, we have not heard from an administrator wrestling with this issue, and I would love to hear. I think there is somebody at UNC who's part of a Title IX campaign, and there are a few here and there. But I think it would be really fascinating to know, like, what the thought process is when all this is going on.
I do want to open this up for questions from the audience, and if you guys have questions for each other, I do have one more question for you, so you guys have a little bit of time to think about things, and that's this, and this is something both of you have said. So, what does this new conversation? If we want to talk about what education looks like in this new era, what does this new conversation look like? What does it mean to educate faculty and staff? Because I think that's part of it, right? Is that if you want this conversation to go past the average length of a student's stay at a college, if you want there to be lasting change, there has to be a much, much larger conversation about consent, about how to talk to survivors, about how to talk about this in classrooms, outside of classrooms. But where does that start, and what does it look like to you? What can we do to help you?
I mean, it's overwhelming because there are probably 50,000 things I would like to see. So it's kind of hard to list them all. But to give you sort of the main highlights, I think, like I was saying in the beginning, like, we have to just rethink what it means to be educating people. And that involves rethinking what it means to teach. So, something that we've seen recently in the Title IX complaints that have come out, Princeton just had their decision publicized this week. They were found to be in violation of Title IX, and Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights basically said, these are the things that you have to do to be in compliance now. And unless you do, items 1 through 8, then we're revoking all federal funding, which is sort of one of the main tactics that student activists have for forcing their institutions to handle this issue. And so this kind of goes back to actually what you're saying about what happens when students graduate. Because I think the idea for a lot of people is, okay, like, I am going to be graduating. I did graduate, and I'm a complainant in our Title IX case. And so theoretically, I'm still connected. Like, when they eventually open our investigation, it's been several months now since we submitted it and still no response. Once that investigation is opened, there will be interviews with the complainants. There will be Those cases will be reopened. So in some ways, it's actually bringing in the state to kind of continue the work, or at least vouch for the work that student activists have been doing, which will probably, actually end up happening after most of us have graduated. So that's one of the benefits of filing these Title IX complaints, is ensuring that the work that's been done is actually going to be enforced, and that there will be somebody who's not going to graduate in 3 years from the Department of Education saying, you have to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to be here until this is done, otherwise, all of your federal funding is gone. So that's, both a sort of solution and also definitely not the whole solution. Because I think it's a brilliant move to use Title IX complaints in this movement, but it's also really easy to get into a culture of compliance where a school just says, okay, well, I have to have, education of faculty, so let's force everybody to take this online 1-hour module, and then we can check off the box saying like, woohoo, we educated our faculty on like how to support survivors, when they just muted video and like did other things for 60 minutes, So, it's not enough to have the piece of paper from the government saying, do this or we're gonna get really mad at you. You actually have to have a meaningful cultural like revolution, essentially, which is hopefully happening. And what that looks like is, not consent education for an hour, but consent education for a week, where you actually talk about, the patriarchy, and you talk about institutional racism, you talk about how sexual violence plays into those things, and you talk about how you can actually not only have good consent practices, but be a better supporter of survivors, and how you can undo rape culture in your day-to-day life. That's not something you can talk about in 60 minutes. You need at least a week to discuss that. And that's asking for a lot, but I think schools that have billion-dollar endowments can figure it out. And then, again, it's not just having it your first year, it's having it your second semester your first year, your first semester second year. It's having this conversation revisited over and over again, to the point that it's not something that you can shove aside and say, oh yeah, that Consent 101 workshop, I remember that and I blew it off. It's something that you can't ignore. And then having faculty actually go through that conversation too. And educating faculty, because they may feel like, oh, I'm in my 40s, I understand what consent is, but many of them probably don't, and I think those definitions evolve as they should, and to leave professors out of that conversation is not helpful. So making sure professors understand what consent means, but also teaching them how, because it's shocking how few people understand what you should say when someone says, I was raped, or I'm a survivor, and I need help. Very few people understand what a helpful response there is, and it's something that you can teach, to people. It's not impossible. If you have good people teaching professors, they will learn and they will understand how to be more compassionate. So I think the goals are so lofty, and they may seem like, oh my gosh, we're never going to do this. And that can be super overwhelming, and it happens to me all the time. I'm like, oh, this is so tiring, and this movement is amazing, but I don't, what are we working towards? What's going to happen? Are we going to be able to keep this up for longer than a year? What happens when people get tired of this? And the answer is you have to institutionalize the culture that you want to see in some ways, and empower people to kind of be in dialogue with that, that institution. So it's not about the demands X, Y, and Z. It's, can we revisit these demands in 2 years to see if we made any progress? Do students have a voice in the reform process? Do we regularly revisit our sexual assault policies and refresh them so that they're culturally relevant? There's so many things that need to happen, and it's overwhelming. But when you actually sit down to think about what these demands look like in real terms, they're doable. They're things that can happen, and we've effectively changed our cultural mindset to a lot of things. Drunk driving, we have effectively condemned. Ideally, we have condemned racism. Of course, people are still racist, but it's harder to excuse it publicly. So we have seen a lot of shifts in mindset that have taken time and hard work, but it's possible, and that's it's hard work, but I think people are getting there, and now the key is just making sure that there's someone to hold people accountable for the demands that we're making.
Does anybody want to give everybody in the audience a chance if anyone has a question?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about affirmative consent specifically. I mean, I have like a general understanding of it, but I'm just curious how that plays into a lot of the campus activism. And so also if you could talk about the difference between like reforms in universities as opposed to like activism reforms for like local government, or like when rapes are reported to like the police, like why university communities, why that? I mean, I'm guessing because there's more potential for change in like an academic setting because it's more focused on students, whereas like trying to change how your local precinct handles reporting rape is kind of a different community issue. So I'm wondering if you could talk about those two things a little bit.
Well, I'll talk about the second one, and you talked about affirmative consent, which I don't know as much about how that's going on with that at this point. I mean, I would say that one of my first questions was, why don't you just go to the police? And I did learn, after asking it a million times, that did not make sense. And so, but it did take me a little while to grasp the concept of it. I mean, first of all, it's the law, right? Title IX makes it the law that you should be able to go to school without facing the fear of gender-based violence. So there doesn't really need to be a discussion about that. But even though that may be a little hard to grasp at a place like NYU when you're dispersed and it's a big city campus, certainly if you were at Gallatin, which is a small school, and the perpetrator was here, that would not be something that would be conducive to study for an individual. Leaving aside that also the police have a pretty bad track record for the most part with rape, I think that related to what Mary Beth was saying, what all this stuff doesn't need to be like homework. It doesn't need to be like, oh no, I'm gonna go learn about patriarchy now and all this sexual assault stuff that's so horrible. It should be a call to your higher self, which is what the university is supposed to be about. It's a time where you're supposed to be able to explore the best sides of yourself, figure out who you want to be, and if it's a slightly higher standard at schools, which I think in some cases it is, and certainly with affirmative consent, until you have affirmative consent for the citizenry, it is a higher standard. Then maybe that's part of what being at a university is about. And I think that could be a really nice message for people to take away. Just call to your more decent higher self to try to bring that into the situation, not only in your own experiences sexually, but also as a bystander, or just, being thinking differently about the way the genders relate than the way you were brought up to think. And so, yeah, but why don't you talk about affirmative consent? Because that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really, I think, kind of a new-ish conversation, at least to a mainstream conversation or mainstream media in terms of what is affirmative consent. So the short answer is affirmative consent is a practice and a process of approaching any sexual relationship, not assuming consent and then waiting for someone to say no, but rather assuming that no consent is given and looking for positive indicators of consent, and really getting verbal indication that someone or your partner or partners are fully enthusiastic and okay with what's going on and on the same page. So a lot of people kind of have a lot of questions about affirmative consent and feel like they feel like it's this ridiculous standard, how could anybody actually do this? It seems so awkward, and are you supposed to sign a contract? How do you actually do this in real life? And that's kind of what hopefully these consent education trainings and discussions that we're asking for are exposing students to like actually give them real tools to be able to talk about sex in a way that's not embarrassing, where you don't have to like make it cutesy in order to really understand how it works. But the general idea is, do we want to live in a world where you assume that you have the consent for everyone around you, in terms of taking up space on the subway, or running into someone on the sidewalk, or in general, just like respecting other people's bodies? Do you want to live in a world where you assume that you have the right to everyone's body and you just wait for them to give you a negative indication? Or do you want to completely flip that, dynamic and flip that thinking and say, I actually don't have the right to anyone's body, and if I want to, have some sort of sexual relationship with someone, then I need to ask, and I need to make sure it's very clear that that person is fully on board with what's happening, and not just that they're on board, but they're like excited about it. And I think this is, connecting to others more like sex positive ways of articulating consent that people may have heard before. But framing it within the sort of anti-sexual violence debate kind of freaks people out, because they think, like if I don't do it, like, everyone must be raping everyone. Or it's very hard for people to understand, but it's really kind of a simple idea that is shockingly easy to do. And the reason it's so shockingly easy is because if you're not sure, then you just ask. And that should usually clear things up. So I think the reason people are pushing that is not only because it liberates people to be able to say no if they want to, when they may feel pressured or coerced, or like they are supposed to be saying yes all the time, and that they aren't allowed to exercise that no. It's great for that reason, but it also is helpful in a sort of hearing panel or adjudication process where a lot of administrators will say, well, like, what did you, how many times did you say no? And how loudly did you say no? How loudly did you scream? Did you fight back? And having an affirmative consent standard means you're no longer in an adjudication process forcing the complainant to prove that rape happened. You're forcing the perpetrator to prove that they have consent. And so it's empowering both to an individual in their own sex lives, but it's also empowering to survivors who are going through an adjudication process, not to have to feel like they have to essentially defend their right to their own bodies, but rather that someone else has to defend or explain and illustrate and justify whether they actually had real consent. Does that make sense?
One of the things is that that I've seen in the last 10 years is, it used to be that there was a discussion about how to prevent sexual assault, and it went something like this. There was like, 10 ways to prevent sexual assault, carry a whistle, use the box, right? And you're all laughing, and that was the way it was. And then in the last 10 years, this has flipped. And so there's, Take Back the Night has done this as well. There are these posters now that say 10 ways to, avoid sexual assault. Don't rape people, right? I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think of affirmative consent that way. And I also think that it's, and this is the sort of sexuality studies scholar in me coming out for a moment, it's about really putting first that it's important to talk about sex as, and to have conversations about sex as a pleasurable activity. And there was this great, because in all of this all hinges on the questions about sex education, and there's a lot of discussion about, parents and children and what you should teach children at what age, and this is also a very active thing going on right now. And I think these two things are absolutely connected. And there's a very powerful article, and I can't remember who wrote it, who says basically, this woman says, what would happen, what would it look like if we taught children that sex was for pleasure, that it wasn't for procreation, but if that was the starting point. And I think in a lot of ways that a lot of these conversations come out of a larger discussion of how we feel about sex, and it feeds into, and it's a gendered issue, it's a classed issue, it's difficult.
And I think one thing that that this conversation is bringing in a mainstream way is people saying not only, okay, I recognize this event in my own life was assault and I need to process it, but that's, we were talking earlier about how in some ways there's an inclination to want to identify with the assaulter to just not feel the pain of what the person who is a survivor has felt. Like, you want to make excuses for that person and say, no, it wasn't so bad, you needed me, and da-da-da-da, because you really have somebody who's in so much pain. And if you start looking at your own life and the things that have happened to you, you're probably going to identify some moments that you didn't like so much either. And I think that that's, this very quintessentially American thing where we have this really Puritan history, and yet we're living in this so overly commercialized and sexualized culture that uses sex to sell everything, right? From like shampoo to tie pins to like cars. I mean, there's nothing that you can't sell with sex. So I think it's just been, a complicated thing for people to try to process that. But the more that happens, the better, because it really is about people in America becoming more sensitive to some of these issues. Now, I mean, I'm not saying this is what it's all about, but it's a good step. There's nothing wrong with it.
I think that's, yeah.
How can we, as a culture, negotiate the very complicated issues of female sexuality that there is a reality that a lot of women do want, as far as sexual fantasy is concerned, they do want to be objectified, sort of things. They do, the rape fantasies are real for a lot of women and for other people. How do we negotiate those from a sex positive standpoint, but at the same time still reaffirming that even when those fantasies are present, the desire the demand for sexual autonomy and preventing sexual violence. How do we improve that?
So it sounds like the question is, how do we reconcile the fact that there is a BDSM community and the fact that we want to value consent? And I think those things are not mutually exclusive, and in fact, I think members of the BDSM community would tell you that consent is like the entire point of that community. And people who have those fantasies, it's not to say that those fantasies are we should ban people from having them, but there still needs to be an ongoing consent practice associated with that. And moreover, I think we all need to kind of reflect on, that fantasy does not exist in a vacuum, right? That people who are interested in, that expression of their sexuality, as long as they're practicing with consent, fine. But at the same time, that fantasy came out of an education, by a culture in which rape is normalized, and we, basically enable sexual violence as a collective. So I think there's two answers to your question. The first is that, consent is actually very crucial to the BDSM community, and I think people who are inside of it would say the perception that it's not about consent is actually perpetuated by abusers within the community who try to kind of hide behind that, that identity in order to get away with their abuse, but that most people within the community actually are extremely diligent about their consent practices. So that's the one side of it, but also, hopefully this movement is getting all of us to reflect on our own experiences and think about, why is this something that I would find pleasurable? What is it about the images that I've seen, the books that I've read, the messages about sex that I've been taught, that this is something that I feel would be exciting to me. And that's not to say that, you know, for every single person, it's like, oh, like rape culture, you know, is around me, and I've been around it for so long, and you know, I, you know, only have this fantasy because of rape culture. But at the same time, I think there does have to be, you know, the willingness to be critical of yourself and, you know, think maybe I have actually contributed to rape culture in some way, or it has slipped into my life in these ways, and how can I be honest with myself and, you know, work to undo that on a very personal level, because I, you know, am a part of this culture in which rape culture exists. Does that make sense?
Well, there's also, and this is something I think about a lot, is that I think it's actually, there's a difference between, I think about it a lot, but I have a hard time articulating it, sorry. There is a very fine line for many people between pleasure and shame. And there are very complicated reasons for that. And there are complicated sociological reasons and psychological reasons. But when you're talking about consent, you have to remember the following. Sex, in as much as it is an act that happens between people, requires empathy. And it is not enough to think you know what someone else is feeling. You have to move beyond that and actually feel what they're feeling. And I have never, you know, in all of the things that I have studied and all the people that I've talked to, never talked to somebody who participated in BDSM or talked about rape fantasies or talked about these very sort of, what for many of us are gray areas, who could not tell the difference between somebody who was actively participating in something they enjoyed and somebody who was being hurt in a way that they did not enjoy. And that is really what it is. It is difficult for human beings to empathize with other people, and it's difficult to really reconcile that. And this gets at, both of you have said this, that one of the hardest things about this whole conversation on college campuses is when anybody questions an act, when anybody questions any type of sex, it reverberates down the entire community. And I, as a listener, can hear back in I can hear my own experiences, and that it can be very troubling. And I think that that dealing with that discomfort and learning how to work through it is really part of the education that you guys are talking about. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So, given that this is a larger cultural and political issue, and given that our systems of who and how we punish are fraught with their own systemic oppressions, and given that these instances are very personal and individualized issues, how can we create policies to deal with perpetrators, and what can retribution and restoration for the survivor look like?
Well,
degrees of justice right now.
But I mean, I think that you have heard a lot of people in this movement start to say they should be expelled. And I think from a rational point of view, if you say, let me read you back exactly what this guy was found responsible for, since we don't use the word guilty, and it says, you know, sexual misconduct involving threat of injury or, you know, various bad things, which certainly fit even the criminal justice's, you know, definition of rape. Why would you let this person back on your campus? You found him responsible of this. This is what you said. You're going to make him go away for a semester, and then he gets to come back. So I think that's again, very effective. It's rational. You know, as far as you know, shaming perpetrators, I think that is a pretty good tool when you really look at it. Definitely could potentially get out of control. It's the thing really that the colleges are the most afraid of, other than the effect on endowments and bad media attention, because it kind of implies an unruly group of students who are not, again, abiding by the laws. So I think it's much more threatening. The public shaming aspect of it is really seen as a very serious move by the administration. And it's interesting to think, like, is it really that serious? Why is this so serious? Particularly if it's about the wall and it's not on the internet, where you feel like, oh no, now the world knows it. I don't know. I mean, that's something that people used in the 90s and was pretty effective in the 90s. So those would be my thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's great to hear you mention sort of the fact that for pretty much every adjudication process, the approach is one in which the goal is to punish the perpetrator and kind of ignore the needs of the survivor beyond the sanction. So, and I think a lot of people articulate this in a framework of restorative justice. So thinking about, not to say that expulsion is not an option, but for many survivors, they might have a vision of justice that doesn't include expulsion, doesn't include rejecting someone from a community. And I think you see this especially in cases of dating violence, which are not really as, I would say, covered in mainstream media right now, which is starting to change. But for many people, the idea of if I went and reported my assailant or my perpetrator or my abusive partner, and the only option is to expel them from the community, then that may not be a very appealing option for many people for a lot of reasons. Maybe this person, really, despite the person being abusive, they still love them and care for them, and are looking for things that would be healing for them. So re-education of the perpetrator, forcing them to go through consent education, or education that's specifically anti-sexist, or counseling for both the perpetrator and the survivor, academic accommodations. So there are a lot of things that we don't traditionally think about being a part of the equation in terms of reporting and why someone would report and what they would want to get out of reporting. But hopefully we're thinking about, for many people, they really want their perpetrators expelled. And Emma, for example, has said in very clear terms, I want my rapist to be expelled. And what I think the movement in general is pushing for is not, these are the sanctions that should be given for X Act and Y Act and Z Act, and under no circumstances should we give anything other than this sanction. Instead, it's saying, let's actually listen to survivors and hear what they want. Like, what does justice look like for them? And the idea of there being some, administrative entity that decides what justice looks like for every single person who experiences specific acts is actually very disempowering for the survivor. And ideally, we're working towards a system in which, there isn't sort of a slate of options that, the hearing panelists or a university or a dean would decide, but instead, you go through the process. If the person is found responsible, you ask the survivor, what would justice look like for you? And that's a kind of radical idea for a lot of people that shouldn't be radical. Like asking, what actually would make this better for you? What do you need to heal? What do you need to feel like justice has been done? And that may include, expulsion. That may include counseling. That may include, reparations or financial restitution. There are a lot of things that can include, and it could be all of those things or only one of those things. And ultimately, hopefully, we're approaching this from a perspective in which we're listening to survivors, because it's the only way we're ever going to know, what justice looks like for them. So I think that's, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Name's here. Oh,
I'm
there you
a
are.
senior in high school, and I have a feminist group, and when I walk out of in the hallway and I see all the other people in high school, it's like really different from in the classroom to outside. And it kind of scares me, like all my friends going off to college next year being alone. And I was wondering, how do you, like after someone rapes someone, and I don't really know my question, but like after someone rapes someone and they have something happen to them, but how do you teach people beforehand, before they rape people? I think that's the more important thing, instead of saying what happens after they rape someone, but what happens before they rape someone. And with all rape culture going on, like everything around media and what we're talking about, how do you teach boys and girls what rape is and how to not do it when it's so prevalent in our society?
Great question, and I'm really glad that you're here. This is great that we have high school people. We hopefully are getting this conversation to younger and younger folks, and there's actually a great article on Everyday Feminism about ways that you can teach consent from birth to age 18 at age-appropriate levels that I think is exactly the answer to your question. So a lot of this, comes from parents, but a lot of it comes from teachers as well within K through 12 education, which Title IX is actually includes K through 12 education, which a lot of people don't know. But so essentially the idea is, how do we teach people to value consent, and how do we both teach people who might potentially perpetrate violence against another not to do that, but also how do we empower communities and help communities stand in solidarity with the survivor if they do experience violence? Because I think a lot of research on the subject shows that in communities where perpetrators feel like they have the license to operate, which is basically, do they feel like in that community, if they perpetrated violence against someone, nobody would hold them accountable, or people would turn away, or sweep them under the rug, then that person is actually much more likely to perpetrate violence. So, consent education plays an extremely important role, not only in educating people on what consent actually is and how to give it and how to get it, but also it empowers communities to understand what that looks like and be more empathetic with survivors. And if they do, if someone does name a perpetrator within that community, people who go through consent education are much more likely to condemn that behavior. And if there's a pattern of condemning perpetrators rather than condemning survivors, then that kind of has like a ripple effect that empowers survivors in the future and prevents perpetrators from feeling like they get away with violence. So essentially, we're asking for consent education from day one of, kindergarten, essentially. And that doesn't necessarily mean, saying to 5-year-olds, like, this is what you say when you're having sex with someone. Instead, it's little things like, asking before you hug someone, are you a hugger or not really? And that small little thing of asking for someone's permission before you touch them is actually huge. And teaching children, like, it's actually, you can say to grandma, like, I don't really want to give you a kiss goodbye, but I'll like wave goodbye or give you a high five or something like that. And teaching kids that there are ways of showing love that don't require physical touch, and you're not failing, or it's not that you don't love someone if you don't express yourself through hugs or kisses or whatever it may be. So the messaging kind of can be altered for all different ages, and I think as kids mature, you can also mature the content of that messaging. But essentially, it's on parents, it's on teachers, it's on elders within a community, it's on everybody. Not to use the language of the It's On Us campaign, but it's on all of us to get that message across to young people and to support survivors. So I'm not sure if that really answered your question, but yeah.
All right, that was a great question. Thank you, and thank all of you for coming out tonight, and thank you guys for leading us in this.